This afternoon we're moving on to a little bit more attention to the section of this use of means of grace related to Holy Communion and the Christian Assembly. As I mentioned earlier, for much of the time that we've had these kinds of teaching statements around sacramental practices, it was focused on communion, and the use of the means of grace set that in the larger context of all of the means of grace. And including baptism, the word, the proclamation of, and in addition to the sending, even that prayer that we just heard already takes us in the direction of that. And you'll notice that as a shift in emphasis a little bit. Some of our previous resources that even in that post-communion prayer, oftentimes were taken from the table into mission, into that sending into the world. But we also have some of the particular questions that have sparked this most recent conversation over the past 12 months or so in the ELCA, and we want to give some good ample time for you to talk about those questions among yourselves and with the group. Just to back up a little bit, we have talked about how our practices in many places have changed around Holy Communion. And if you look at the use of the means of grace and walk through it a little bit, you might say, well, a lot of this seems really obvious. You know, we've been doing this for a while. Why do we need to state this? Many of us have emphasized these kinds of points in our teaching and our preaching. What are some of those, obvious things or things you sort of take for granted now that Christ is the one who invites. It's Christ's table. It's Christ's initiative. The real presence of Christ. We continue to confess that and to teach that and to preach that. If anything, we've probably moved away from trying to explain it so much. There was a time when we thought we had to assemble a whole lot of arguments around that were intellectual in basis, and we've moved more to a place of saying, yes, really present. Do we try to explain it or to scientifically analyze it? No. Another thing that we've learned in one of the sections of the use of the means of grace, it has all of these different names for the sacrament. And what each of those means, I think we've all done that. If you've had any kind of First Communion class, you've taken young people through the various meanings of, or the various names and how they bring a little bit different dimension to the meaning of the sacrament, like facets of a diamond. It's not just one thing. It's not just forgiveness. It's also community. It's not just sacrifice in the best sense of that word as thanksgiving, but it's also, and most importantly, a gift. And all of those paradoxes and the richness of the meaning of communion comes through in the various names that we have for the sacrament. I think there was a time when we probably didn't use words like Eucharist, or even now I think Mass is pretty rare among Lutherans, although it occurs in some places. But certainly the Lord's Supper and the sacrament of the altar and all of those other descriptions continue to describe what it is that we're doing. Beyond those kind of essentials, there are other principles that are becoming more and more commonplace, but not universal by any means. At times they were more unusual, some of them even thought radical. The integration of word and meal into a single liturgy. Since 1978, Lutheran Book of Worship, it's been called Holy Communion, the whole thing. It's not just that part that is the sacramental meal, but the whole service is given the title Holy Communion. And that was continued, or Santa Comunión, that was continued in the most recent generation. There was some talk about, well, maybe we should go to Eucharist or something else, but really Holy Communion continues to be a more universal way of describing what it is we're doing there, that we commune not only in the meal, but in the proclamation of the word as well. A trend toward a more frequent celebration. Some places weekly, maybe not every service. We continue to see, statistically on the reports that come through, there has been a slow and steady increase over the ELCA in the congregations that are offering it some kind of experience of Holy Communion on a weekly or more frequent basis at least. Perhaps they've increased it from 4 times a year to monthly. but there's been a trend in that direction that seems to have continued over the past 25 years or so. But that one time that was rare to have something like a weekly celebration of the sacrament. Another thing that's become more common, but by no means universal, is a lowering of the age at which children first commune. I was talking to one person here today who said, Amanda, that congregation is still at an older age, and there are congregations that haven't really moved far from their earlier practice of communion at the end of confirmation, for instance, at 8th grade or 9th grade. But even since, I would say, the use of the means of grace in 18, 20 years ago, it seems as though there's been even more of a move toward younger and younger ages for communion. So when we were doing resource development for sacramental resources for children, the question was, well, how should that be presented? And the conclusion was there needed to be some resources for very young children, pre-K, that age group, not reading, whatever. Maybe something then also for first and second, third graders, and then something certainly for 4 to 6. I would say, this is where sometimes we get, at the publishing level, we get to see, what are the ones that sell the most. And still, the 4 to 6, that age group is the highest selling group, which says that probably reflects congregational practice, that at least those congregations that use some kind of curriculum for that, many of them are still there. But there is a trend there, younger and younger, towards the either early elementary or even before that. And increasingly we're seeing congregations that are, and parents oftentimes initiate this, that say they would like that even at baptism, that there's be some recognition of being initiated, brought into both sacraments. Maybe it's just a thumb in the wine, at baptism, but it's happening more often. And yet I think there's also become a little more of a tolerance of the diversity from one congregation to the next. One of the concerns that was raised even back in 1980 when the move was to 5th grade was, what's this going to do to congregations? One is doing this age, another is doing this age, and people are mobile and they're moving from one church to the next, and how's that going to work? It feels as though there's more of an opportunity or an acceptance that there are diverse practices, and that congregations have come to terms with some of that. But it's not to say it isn't an issue that continues to be a need, something that you need to address. Another principle that's become more widespread in its practice is the use of lay assisting ministers, and I remember from my own childhood, you never received anything except from the pastor's hand. It was there was something about that. But I think in many, many congregations, whether it's the technical assisting minister role in the liturgy, or whether it's just using lay people, perhaps council members or others as ministers of communion, there's much more acceptance of that in congregations now than there probably was 25 years ago. And the sending of communion to those who are absent, who are shut in, or who are sick. There was a time when only the pastor did that. And I think as congregations have embraced things like the Stephen series of pastoral caregiving by lay people, there's also been a greater acceptance that lay assisting ministers of communion can take these gifts to those who are absent. Another principle that seems to be becoming more commonplace is the use of a fuller prayer of thanksgiving around the table. It's helped that there have been some of those resources that are shorter. I remember when we were doing With One Voice, one of the things was, more congregations might use a prayer of thanksgiving if they weren't so dang long. And so to have shorter versions of some of those prayers that can lift up our thanksgiving for all of God's created gifts and call on the Spirit's blessing is happening more often. More ample use of real bread. I think we've seen a trend towards that. More congregations are willing to experiment or move to bread that isn't burned in those bread baking machines, but that is real bread that has the texture. And better tasting wine. Wouldn't that be a nice goal to achieve? We actually had wine that tasted a little better. I think that's happening in some places. People are thinking about it at least. And at the same time, heightened sensitivity to those for whom those elements are problematic, whether it's the need for gluten-free bread or for de-alcoholized wine or grape juice. I mean, those tensions are people are confronting them a little bit more than I think they were 25 years ago, where it was just it's this, and that's all there is, and maybe an occasional pastoral exception. And what else? What else has become where we've seen some movement? A broader table hospitality. Clearly, over the past 3 decades, as we've entered into more full communion relationships, as we've seen more diversity in our own congregational memberships, where people are marrying across denominational lines, and so I think generally there's been a trend towards greater acceptance that as Christians we are gathered around this one table. This is Christ's table. So those are some of the things that have led to that becoming more common. And perhaps another thing that's happened and is continuing to happen is there's this deeper awareness of why we commune. That it is something that we need, that we desperately need this constant infusion of God's grace. Whereas we've talked about baptism being by this time that initiates us into this life. Communion is the way that baptism is continually one way that baptism is continually renewed and refreshed, and also because of an understanding of communion more as to what it does to us. That we are not just here for our own spiritual nourishment. That's important. But part of that spiritual nourishment is that it takes us out from the place where we gather and into the world. What difference does this meal do for us and to us? Expressed in words of some early church fathers, that we are what we eat. We become Christ's body when we share in this meal. We aren't really living as the body of Christ if it stops there in that place. One of our newer hymns, I think this is Susan Briel's text, but send us now with faith and courage to the hungry, lost, bereaved. In our living and our dying, we become what we receive. That is, we become Christ's body, broken and now shared in us beyond our own lives and into the living of our lives and into the living of the world's life. So all those topics are there in that section of the use of the means of grace and are good things to explore. I think of all of the areas of the use of the means of grace, that's often one that's of most interest to people, to lay folks as they say, let's study communion. Oftentimes coming up on Maundy, Thursday, or in Lent, it's a good study to have. But here are some questions particularly related to this, what I mentioned as this trend towards a greater table hospitality. And so the questions have arisen in many places. What does that mean? What does it mean when we, even in the words that are printed in the book, come to the banquet, for all is now ready. Taste and see that the Lord is good. To whom are we looking? Whom are we addressing in those words? But for our discussion right now, what we'd like to do is to take a little time and talk with one another about these questions. First of all, I won't ask for a show of hands, but maybe as you talk with one another, you can talk about the question, has your congregation, or if so, how has your congregation engaged some of these questions related to the table and who is invited? And then, in particular, something very concrete that you can talk about is, what does your congregation have some kind of statement about that invitation to Holy Communion? And if so, just kind of share that with one another. And is there a written form of it that appears in your worship folder or on the little communion, the cards that sit in a lot of our little pew racks? And then is there also a spoken version of that? What do you say in the context of the liturgy, in the announcements, or just before people come to communion? How do you express that? And how do those two relate? If you've got a written one and a spoken one, how do they relate to one another? So that's the topic for conversation. If you just talk a little bit about those questions related to that invitation to communion, and talk amongst the folks at your own table, or move around as you see fit. Thank you.
What we need is here. What we need is here. What we need is here. What we need is here.
So you've resolved all the issues. That's really good to know. Yeah, so this is a time for us to raise to the light of everyone here some of the things that have come up, questions or comments maybe to start with from your group. First of all, about the question, does your congregation have some kind of statement that just a description of what you do? Any particular things that you want to share?
And if you could share kind of in a nutshell what that sounds like. Yeah.
It's a nutshell. Yeah.
I so appreciate your encouragement, Steve. I'm a contract supply pastor right now in a very small congregation, and I've been there for 5 weeks, so I'm basically learning how they do things. And I said I was ashamed to admit that I hadn't even really thought about that. I just was doing what they put in front of me. And we have no verbal or written welcome to the table. So there's a learning point opportunity there. And it saddens me that I had missed it.
And as you're speaking, if you would just sort of speak into the microphone so we can hear, that'd be great.
At Rejoice in Frisco, where I serve, we have a lot of people come in and out very frequently. And so one of the things I do, I'm very intentional about not only inviting them to the table, but how they're going to be receiving. So this is God's meal for God's people. Everyone is welcome here. If you're a guest here with us at Rejoice today, please know that you are welcome here at Christ's table. As you are ushered forward, you will receive bread, which you can eat when you receive it. And there will also be a tray which has both grape juice and wine in it. The wine is red, the grape juice is clear. You may choose whichever you prefer. And then invite them to be seated as we prepare for communion.
Okay, thanks. Others?
We have a statement written out in our bulletin, and it's a sense that says we practice open communion, which means you don't have to be Lutheran to enjoy God's feast here. This is God's table, not ours. Children of all ages are welcome to commune, but we know that it's a parent's decision. So if your child does not commune, then we ask them to fold their arms over, because to us, the open hand is a sign that you're receiving communion. And we put communion in any hand that's open up there at the table. And it's not as explicit to say that even if you're not baptized, you're welcome here. But we let them know that the grace is present here. It's embodied in the bread and the wine. And if this is something that you need in your life, you're certainly welcome to come and receive with us.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sometimes the less said, the better. You know, in those kinds of announcements, we tend to get awfully wordy about that, and sometimes that, you know, if you have to read 4 paragraphs to figure out if it's right, then yeah.
Ours just says all are welcome to the Lord's table, and then there's some basic instructions. And I didn't see Pastor Ethan in here, but there is. So there it's verbally said, all are welcome to the Lord's table. Tell them what Kyrie.
So Kyrie is open to the public. So we don't have our own building. We aren't shoved off in our own room. So there's all sorts of people in the room when we do it. And I think I say, communion at Kyrie is open to all, so please come as you are ready and willing to take, and we just make a big horseshoe around the post that's in the center of the room, and that's pretty much the extent of the instructions that there.
Okay. Yes, down front here. Scott.
We have a lot of Missouri Synod that show up at our church, so kind of in a joking but serious way, oftentimes if I know they're Missouri, I just simply say, we celebrate the Lord's Supper, not Lutheran supper, all are welcome. And it's amazing how many Missouri Synod folks have said thank you. We just assumed we were not welcome.
In a previous call, before I became mission director, I had a profound experience. There was a young woman, probably in her 30s, who came in to talk with me, just kind of from a neighboring neighborhood and off the street sort of thing, and we had a conversation, and it was about relational issues within her family. That's really all you need to know. And suddenly, the next Sunday, she showed up in worship. And at the time of communion, we had 8 servers because we had multiple aisles who came forward because they were going to be served the sacrament first, and she came with her daughter with those servers. And in my opinion, I was not about to say to her, "You ain't welcome here, lady." For me, that became the entry rite for her in that moment into the community of faith, not baptism. That came later.
Yeah, and Susan Brill, who is a pastor in the Lutheran Church, married to Bishop Martin Wells in Idaho Washington Synod, she's often been quoted as saying, and I hope I get this right, you can tell me if I do or not, some of us come to the table through the font, some of us come to the font through the table, or something like that. And Susan's point about that is that we live in a world where we, one, can't assume that everybody who comes into the Lutheran Church was raised Lutheran, was brought up Christian, knows anything about liturgy, or has any sacramental understanding. The second point that I would add to that, we also now, as you may know, we can't assume that those who were raised Lutheran, who now come back into the Lutheran Church, know anything about what it means about being a Lutheran Christian, the sacraments, or liturgy. Am I right? At least from my experience, I think that's somewhat true. The other thing is, I think Martin and I were talking about this, there's a clear distinction that's important for me to make between welcome and invite. Are all welcome in the Christian assembly? I would say absolutely. How do we invite people, to me, is different. I don't think that we put gates or bars around God's table. And if you read the use of the means of grace, they're not there, by the way. But I do think it's our responsibility as presider and teacher to offer welcome, but then to do the hard work of inviting. Because inviting means teaching. Inviting means being responsible for people's spiritual care. Inviting means maybe going on a limb and meeting people where they are, but maybe not leaving them there. And it also puts us in a vulnerable situation to have to ask maybe hard or awkward questions. But I think if we're willing to do that, people will appreciate that we invited them in a journey. An example that I'd like to share is a few years ago, the congregation I was serving, there was a young woman and her 2 children and husband who were members of the church. They were there when I got there. I just thought they were a really sweet family. I only knew their names. I knew very little about them. And 3 or 4 months passed, and in the worship folder I had put, if you're interested in joining Holy Trinity, please see me after worship, and I'll let you know about our new member orientation classes. And Jill came up to me and she said, Pastor Kevin said, we're really interested in joining the church. Well, I'd been there 4 months. I just assumed they were members. I mean, I guess I should have done better homework, or we didn't have a pictorial director or anything like that. We're too small. And I said, oh, I thought you were a member. She said, oh, no. She said, I'm Jewish. She'd been coming to the table for 4 months, and I'd been giving her communion because her hand was out. And I found out that her kids had never been baptized, she had never been baptized, and she wanted to convert to being a Christian. And so we went through the Lenten process of the adult catechumenate, and Jill walked through that entire process. The cool thing was we did it intergenerationally, and Jill and her kids walked through what it meant to be a Christian and what it meant to be a baptized child of God. On Easter Sunday morning, I invited our bishop to be present for our worship service, and our bishop baptized Jill and her 2 children, and she was back at the table. She made a choice to step away from receiving communion during that catechumenal process, but I did not urge her in that way. She told me afterwards, she said, I've learned more about what it means to be a Christian than I ever did about what it means to be a Jewish person. And she said, I have profound respect for why we do what we do. Her kids walked through the process with her, and they all 3 asked really hard questions. Every week, I was like, this is worse than seminary. They were asking questions that I was like having to pull books off shelves and find answers to. I mean, even the 7-year-old. But they were engaged. And Mom went home and did what parents can do better jobs at. They had catechesis training at home. They went home and talked about their relationship with God around the dinner table. They went home and talked about what does the church mean. They went home and talked about what is bread and what is wine, and what does it mean as God's gift to us. And they went home and talked about what does it mean to be washed and claimed and called God's own. I tell that story only because I think we have people in every one of our congregations that we can make lots of assumptions about, am I right? Who have probably been members for years, who we don't know their story. And there's some congregations we're in that are really large. And there's some that aren't size large, but they're demanding of time. But maybe you've had experiences to where you've engaged people in conversation about where they are on their spiritual journey or their faith practices that has been life-giving to you and provided life for them in that assembly. I don't know. My question to you is, what does teaching mean to you? And how might it be important in your congregation, or is it important? How are children and youth nurtured in the Christian faith in your congregation? How are new members instructed? Does it connect with the sacraments in your congregation? How are preparations for baptism and Holy Communion the same, and how do they differ? Why might preparation for both sacraments be valuable, and what might be required? And why might preparation for either sacrament be unnecessary or even beneficial? That's a lot to ask, and then to throw in there, I've often noticed we spend a lot of time explaining Holy Communion to someone, but we don't do a lot with baptism. Have you ever listened to the words for the Thanksgiving for baptism? These are the waters of new birth. And then we say, come to the water. I don't know about you, but I would probably completely do a cartwheel if someone ran out of their pew on a Sunday morning when I said, come to the water, and said, it's me, I'm here, I want to come to the water, I want to be baptized. And then, like a story from Scripture, what prevents me from being baptized? You know, in a sense, that is our altar call. In a sense, it's an opportunity to clothe people with God's love. In a sense, it's an opportunity to remind people, as I said earlier, that we're not alone in this journey of faith together. So, just aloud and in this space here, what do you do for teaching in your congregation of inviting people into the sacraments? What do you do in connection with intergenerationally speaking, and how does that happen? Is it a Lenten process? Do you have a 2-week class process? Or do you send someone home with a flyer and say, look it up on Google? Or, I mean, what's your process? I'm kind of curious about that. And maybe you have some gems that could be helpful for one another here in the space. And now as we come back together, just if anyone would like to share insights to glean from one another. How do you do teaching in your congregation, and how do you do that maybe even intergenerationally, inviting people into this process? If I have to start singing again, I'll do that, but everyone come back. Yeah, we'll take a few folks. If you would, just sort of share what you're doing in your congregation that might be helpful for someone else.
Hello. There we go. I'm trying, Chris. I really am. One of the things that I have begun to realize more and more is that the catechesis does not necessarily all have to happen before whatever rite we are doing, whether that's baptism or communion or confirmation. In confirmation we talk about, we sort of bemoan in the church, it's become kind of a graduation, like you've learned everything and now you're done and you can stop. And we've set that up that way by setting up this idea that, okay, you have to learn all this stuff and then you get whatever this rite is, and so it's like a check box, a series of check boxes that you just go down. Okay, you've got it, now you can get baptized, or now you can get married, or now you can whatever. And I think that it has to be part of a greater conversation, a bigger arena of learning for our people, of an ongoing lifelong process of learning the Christian life.
Yeah, thank you.
I think just one little story related to that. I mean, I think in part the fact that we have extended this invitation to children, very young children in many congregations. So what does it mean then? We have a little girl in our congregation whose name is Chloe, and I mean, she's been communing since, probably she can't remember when she started communing. But she's the one that started the practice of, if the pastor didn't give her a big enough piece of bread, she would let you know. More, please, may I have some more? So from then on, now it's like 2 bites for almost everybody in the congregation. We've had to go to double the bread. But Chloe now is approaching she's 8 this year. And she knows that a lot of her friends who are in Roman Catholic circles are experiencing their first communion. Well, she's been communing for a long time. So then it raises some additional questions. So how do you mark that? How does catechesis happen? In that case, it's been happening all the way along, but what can we do in some ways to mark this for Chloe to help her? Sometimes I think it has a little bit to do with dress envy, because some of her friends have, some pretty fancy dresses, but that's one of the questions that I think arises when we don't do the catechesis all at one time, but can really stage it out.
Yeah. Yes.
One of the defaults I have when I hear about instruction, I go back to how I was instructed, and it was the lecture format. So the pastor spoke, we took notes, and then there was a test. And to think in this new world of how people learn and what the opportunities are for them is to kind of redefine what that instruction looks like. And for me, it's become more about instilling habits in people.
Yeah.
And the practice of doing, then the belief or the understanding begins to set in. So how do we as a congregation, is a question we ask, partner with parents in the home to establish these habits? So the habits of prayer, the habits of Bible reading, and then the habits that are associated inside of worship. So we just celebrated this parenting in the pew milestone for parents with 3-year-olds. So helping them to engage in worship. My wife, with our kids who commune, she grew up very Catholic, so there's a lot of reverence. So hold your hands, kneel down, hear the words that you say. You're practicing the Lord's Prayer and such. And so it's in my hope and belief is that the habits will become kind of second nature to them, and then the belief will begin to settle in for us. So it makes us begin to ask the question in terms of our instruction, how we prepare for it. How do we incorporate that into our teaching, rather than, for me and how I grew up, was just basically, here's the information and data dump, and now regurgitate it to us. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. One of the things I did in the last 2 congregations was to do kind of Worship 101 classes. And I did that for children and youth, but also did it kind of in an adult way. And we did 4-week classes. So there was the gathering class, the word class, the meal class, and the sending class. And we did the 4-part pattern of worship and taught it that way. And incorporated some of the language of the use of the means of grace, but maybe not quite so nerdy or church talk, made it a little bit more friendly. And part of the class was to even have people dress up. Maybe it's because as a kid I like to do that. Maybe I still like to do that. Maybe that's why I love all the stuff of church. But we had people dress up in all the pastor stuff. And I had, this was in Fort Lauderdale, I had a woman who grew up Roman Catholic and then became a Lutheran later in life. And she was probably 70-ish, and she came to all 4 of these classes, and I asked her to be my model. And so she put on the alb, and I explained what alb meant, white, and purification from the Latin word, and even in the Jewish understanding of the baptismal garments and all these other things. And we put on the cincture and then the stole, and then I put the chasuble on her and stuff. And she just stood there. I mean, she was like totally freaked out by all this stuff. And then afterwards, I had people go around the altar, and we talked about why we put things on the altar and what's on the altar. And we had the kids actually made bread that we used for communion the next Sunday, and just all those tangible pieces. And we did lots of great teaching, but it involved different ages and that type of thing. Another resource that might be helpful, sorry I'm moving, is Worship Matters. And Martin can say more about this in just a minute, but it's a great resource for you to lead in your congregation, and it has DVD in the back of it that you can show as part of the class. But Worship Matters, a source book, it breaks it up into class formats for you, so where it is dialogue and not just a talking head. And I think it even does it in a good way to where you can model this for children and youth too. But it does a great way of kind of talking about why we do what we do and what matters. And you can adapt it to your own circumstances, but I would say definitely try that. It also gets to some of the questions about what are we saying in Sunday mornings, and what are we putting in our worship folders, and is it a consistent message? The other piece that I wanted to talk about was the last part of the use of the means of grace. The means of grace in the Christian mission. In every celebration, the means of grace, God acts to show forth both the need of the world and the truth of the gospel. In every gathering of Christians around the proclaimed word and the holy sacraments, God acts to empower the church for mission. Jesus Christ, who is God's living bread come down from heaven, has given his flesh to be the life of the world. This very flesh given for this life of all is encountered in the word and sacraments. So, what do you see as the greatest challenges of worship today? Just out loud. Relevancy. What else? Time commitment. Yep. Competition. What's the group down the street doing? I think competition not just from other denominations or churches, but if your community is like my community, there's tennis and soccer and running and other things that happen on Sunday mornings.
The competition is sports.
Competition with sports. Sunday is just like any other day. What other things do you see as the struggles for worship today? Yes.
So I would say that we always point outside the church. It's the culture's problem. It's the world messing us up. But I mean, I'm coming from a mentor who very much would say that it's that we don't live converted lives. We don't live baptismal lives, and the church doesn't live into its baptismal calling. That the problem isn't always outside in the world and the culture, but it's also, there's something amiss within the culture of the church itself that needs to die and be reborn.
Okay, thank you.
I think the most problem in church today is that the church wanted to please the world and not to please God. So it find that it get out of its direction.
Thank you. Yeah, Catherine, go ahead. Yeah.
I think one of the things I found was sort of perplexing as a worship leader is remembering, oh, thank you. Sorry. Thinking about and thinking about how to make sure our worship life is for everyone who's going to end up in the room, which is not necessarily people who are churched, who are baptized, who are even believers, and to try to remember not to speak as if we are a homogenous group of people in any of those respects, or marginalize any of the people in the room who may, have an identity that we don't tend to think about, while also having integrity within what our liturgical theology is.
And that's a hard paradox. And that's a hard road to walk, I think. Yep.
The accessibility to TV and online and radio Christian-y kind of programs. I was very surprised to find out how many people in this small African-American church love Crespo Dollar and Joel Osteen, and that if they can't come to church, they just listen to that, and that's good enough, and that's a problem.
Yeah. The reason I ask this question is because of this cartoon. You can't really see it, but it says success. We moved away from the edge. Next crisis in 90 days. All of these things you mentioned, they're realities of living ministry in this world in this time. Whereas the history that Martin gave, he was talking about some of the challenges that were part of the church 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. The things you're mentioning now are the challenges we deal with today. So how can those challenges, how can living on the edge not make us feel like we're always trying to hospice a challenge or hospice a crisis, but how do we faithfully navigate those people who are in the assembly that aren't all of one mind, body, or thinking? Gordon Lathrop said that all Christian worship has to do with the center and the edges, the real center of Christian faith and the edges of human existence. In other words, it's supposed to be the group that you just mentioned. Tim Wangert gives insight into this topic. He says, Christian worship is a centripetal force pulling us into the center to the name given among mortals by which we must be saved. And at the center of Christian worship, we encounter the Trinity and even more Christ, crucified and risen again for us. The merciful God stands at the center of worship. So how can all of these things we mention lead us into a call to be agents of mission in the world, fed by these means of grace, and not feel like we just have a lot of burden to take care of? I think part of it is we go to Dr. Luther. Luther talked about worship challenges and worship issues and communities that weren't all the same, even back in a sermon in 1525 that he preached on Christmas Day. Now think about this. If you're in Christmas Day Mass and you're listening to this, your very fuzzy, warm, emotive pastor stands up and says, "When I was naked, you clothed me. Hungry, you fed me. You say if I had been there, I would have helped Mary. Well, sure you can say that now because you know who her child was. Why do you not help the poor who are Christ in your midst?" Merry Christmas from Martin Luther. It was in that same sermon that Luther said, take those offering plates, rough translation, off the wall and put them to where people literally have to knock them over to get out of the doors. That way they don't have to look for their help. It's right in front of them. Luther was already connecting the dots for people in 1525 and before about how do we take the challenges of the world, the challenges of the gospel, the challenges of the Christian assembly, how does all of that shape us for being propelled into Christian mission each and every day of our lives after we've been fed by word and sacrament? So Tim Wangert says, thus at the fringes we encounter the center, and at the center the fringes. I think when we say go in peace, serve the Lord, we're really saying go in peace, now you can get to work. Because it's not just a simple, sweet little thing we say at the end of service to where everyone knows, oh great, we're done, now we can go to lunch. I think if anything, it's almost like you've been given your tools for the week, now go out and do all this stuff. And oh, by the way, you're going to have to come back because you're going to need to be refueled. And then go out and do it again. And oh, by the way, you don't have to do it alone because you got all these people who are going out with you. But when we say go in peace, serve the Lord, our worship doesn't end. Worship is work that is never completely done. After we're fed and nourished by God's word and by the bread and wine, we don't settle in for a long winter's nap. We're not the same people who gathered. We've been formed again, remembered in Christ's body, and we are ready to serve the Lord with gladness. So how does our worship of God interact with human cultures? How do we learn who our neighbor is and how to serve and love them? How does worship of God send us out to serve the world? I think often we do a really good job of praying for the needs of our community. I think sometimes we do a good job of talking about the needs of the world in our proclamation of the gospel known as a sermon. I think sometimes we do a good job in making that proclamation clear and concise in our hymnody and our singing. But in my experience, I think where we could do a better job is how we propel people into the mission of Christ's church in the world, in the sending part of the service. And that's been beefed up in our renewal of worship through Evangelical Lutheran Worship and its resources. It's been beefed up over these past 15 years as we've been looking at what that means. So what does it mean? If we're going to talk about helping the refugees who live down the street, what does it mean not to just talk about it, but to connect it with the piece of ministry that we actually do with them? At Holy Trinity, where I was serving in Nashville, we did the God's Work Our Hands Day, which I'm sure some of you have participated in. And that year I decided that we were a suburban congregation that had kind of an urban mentality. And that was kind of weird because we weren't really sure what to do with ourselves. And so there's a huge homeless population that lives in downtown Nashville, which you can't see them because they hide during the daytime and they kind of come out at night. But there's lots of children and mothers who live under bridges. And so I thought, well, why don't we do backpacks for the homeless? And we'll just do health kits, we'll do some water bottles, we'll do some other things. So we had all this stuff donated. It was the best intergenerational thing we've ever done as a congregation. The children of the Montessori school put the bags together. The senior citizens helped the children assemble the bags. And then that Sunday morning, all the bags were processed in on the opening song. Everybody grabbed a bag in the narthex, and we all processed it in. We gathered it around the font. And then at the ending of the service, there was a blessing over the bags on the sending song. We said, "Go in peace, remember the poor, and help our homeless." And as we sang all the way to trucks that were out in the front yard with the cross. Each person grabbed one of those bags, processed it to the trucks, put it in the truck, and then we all went in procession. We all went in procession to downtown Nashville where we gave these bags out. And then we had a communion service in the park where we invited the homeless to be part of that event for us. How do we connect the dots with our service to our neighbor with what we're doing? And I don't mean just in that example. I mean with everything we're about. How do we show people that the Monday mentality is being fed by the Sunday opportunity? That who you are Monday through Saturday is being nurtured and fed by the assembly of God and the Word and Sacrament when you gather together in Christian worship. And that God wants you in this world to be propelled in mission. And so these questions, I think, are really important. I think these questions are important as we see how the means of grace feed us, but how we use the means of grace to feed other people, and how we connect this as a missional opportunity for the whole church. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of hearing that the church is dying. I'm kind of tired of hearing that the church doesn't have any money. I'm kind of tired of hearing that we base our success on numbers. Am I alone in that, or are you with me? So I think the better thing that we can do is allow God to do what God does best. Because last time I checked, we have never been a people who are afraid of death. And if this church is meant to be a church, then we will be a church. But if our purpose and mission is to exist now and not exist 20 years from now, then so be it. But let's be the best church we can be for 20 years and not worry about what's going to happen 20 years afterwards. And so in that 20 years or 25 years or 2,000 more years, I would love to see how are we helping people know that they are fed by a loving God who just can't stand but love them. How do we feed people with word and sacrament and connect the dots with our missional opportunities? So Christian worship is the communal encounter with the grace of God incarnate in Jesus Christ. And it involves an encounter with those concrete flesh and blood things that connect us to the flesh of Jesus and so engage us in that grace. Welcoming others must involve welcoming them into this real community. I want to take just an opportunity to offer some time for questions about anything that's been said. As well as Martin and I would like to go over some resources that you may find helpful. So questions, thoughts, observations, things you don't like, do like, favorite food, whatever. Yeah.
I like tacos, favorite food. So
soft shell or hard?
I'm equal opportunity.
Okay.
So for all. Where does the conversation heading in terms of church council and assembly actions? What do you guys envision will happen over the coming months or years?
Yeah,
with that?
thanks. I just finished the report that the Conference of Bishops will hear on Saturday, and then that report will go to Church Council in November. What I didn't say earlier is that we sent out 1,000 letters to congregations and did a random survey of people's communion statements they put in their worship folders, as well as the verbal things that they say. We got about 500 of those back. We then did a statistical graphing of our regions. What's interesting is region 1 and 2 of the ELCA tended to be a fairly open practice of everything, and region 8 and 9 tended to be more of baptism first, closed table, if you will, type thing. The same was sort of true with the responses we got from the 482 that sent in individual or congregational responses. I can't tell you exactly what I'm going to say in the recommendation because it hasn't been approved by Church Council, but I will tell you that I don't see a need for us to edit the use of the means of grace. I also don't see a need for us to change our sacramental practices as a church, because if you read application 37G, it says we don't turn people away from the table if they're not baptized, but it does say that it's the responsibility of that pastor or presider to do some really good teaching and invite people into that relationship with God and with the church of why we baptize in the first place. So I don't think that's ambiguous. I think it's actually pretty clear. The other thing, to alter the use of the means of grace, it does have a little bit of an effect. Well, it doesn't have a little, it has a profound effect on our ecumenical call to common mission. Yeah, Bishop.
I'd like to observe that I found conversation interesting in recent months on the Conference of Bishops web page about who can preside at Eucharist and who cannot. And it's been relatively quiet for years on this subject, but over the last 3 or 4 months, a number of bishops have gotten ants in their pants about lay people presiding at Eucharist and how that is so un-Lutheran and anti-church tradition. And of course, I grew up in the LCA, and we had a very high understanding of communion, and I learned that only clergy could preside at the Eucharist. And that made sense to me in a day and time when we had communion once a month, and we were a rather institutionalized church. But now that I've been in this office for 15 years, and I've seen so many congregations want to move toward weekly Eucharist and actually make that move, and a shortage of clergy, especially for the smaller congregations that can't afford a full-time pastor, we have found it to be an essential part of a missional church that we can authorize lay people to preside on a regular basis. And we have, do we have a dozen synodically authorized worship leaders or more perhaps? I'm looking at Jane.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
we
have at
probably
least that
actually
many.
do.
Right.
Easily.
And I know that this topic is going to be on the table for us over the next week as we meet starting tomorrow up in Chicago. Just curious where you, as worship director, come down on this kind of an issue and what advice you might give us to think about.
Yeah. The synodically authorized ministers were brought into the ELCA. First conversation happened around 1993, and then constitutionally, I think it was in like 1998. For those of you who are aware of how that all happened, the purpose of synodically authorized ministers, or SAMs for short, was that people would be given authorization by their bishop to preside at the table for a short interim of time when an ordained person could not be present to preside. The initial hope out of that would be that those folks, if they felt called to continue in that the bishop's office, along with candidacy and our seminaries, would encourage that person to enter into either the team process or the full candidacy process to receive theological education and then work on being ordained as a word and sacrament minister of this church. There are some folks who, since 1998, are still serving in that same original place as a synodically authorized minister in some synods who have never received team, candidacy, or theological education. That's where I find that a problem, because brain surgeons don't operate on someone's brain without someone teaching them how to operate on someone's brain. I don't perform brain surgery because I'm not well trained, and I haven't been called to be a brain surgeon. Not to say presiding at the table is like brain surgery, but I do think it's a really important thing. And so I do think theological education needs to happen. I think we also need to have a deeper conversation around this topic, Bishop, about what is the mission of the church. I think we need to have a conversation about what does ordination really mean. And I think we need to have an even bigger conversation about what does the ministry of the baptized look like. I don't have answers for all those things, but those are questions I wrestle with. I think the other thing we need to come to terms with is that as people gather more fully around the table, which we've been encouraging for years now, I think we also need to come to terms with how do we handle that in situations to where there are decreasing sizes of congregations, lack of full-time call or even part-time availability, and congregations who still want to form as a congregation. And how are they fed in the means of grace in a way that is true to them? I think those are important questions to ask. But for me, how do we define the ministry of the baptized is the most important. How does that lead us to define the mission of the church? And then how do we define ordination? These are some questions that I'm not sure we fully figured out in 1987 when we began forming this church out of 3 bodies. And I think we still struggle with. That's just an opinion more than anything else. So, but Sunday we'll have a great opportunity to talk about this with 65 bishops. So it should be interesting. I look forward to it. Yeah. Yes.
My question is maybe which looks for another information, but I just wanted your thoughts about the first Christians. They never had ordained minister among them, so they were gathering together, praying and breaking the bread. As simple as that. And now it has to be an ordained minister to administer this ministry. What is your thoughts in relation to both the first and this one?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There were a lot of things the early church did that we don't do anymore. Some of those things I'm glad we don't do anymore. But at the same time, I think that we ordain people in many ways out of good order and to keep good order. And I think we also, as part of that good order, we allow people to see that your calling is not higher than the other person, but you're to perform a presiding task on behalf of the assembly. Just as, my mother who works as a bank mortgage loan officer, I don't know that she's called to do that, but she does it. She does that because that's her job and that's what she feels like she's supposed to be doing right now. And no one ordained her to do that, but someone did check her qualifications and make sure she could do that job. And for good order, she's doing that job to make sure people get mortgages and loans for their homes. I don't have an easy answer for that, but I think out of good order for the church, it's important that we do have ordination. But again, I think we need to figure out how do we define ordination. And as we look at other things that are happening around the church, I think we ask the bigger question, how do we uplift the ministry of all the baptized children of God? But to me, I think it's important that I don't think it's important that everybody in a congregation can stand up and preside at the table. For me personally, I don't want that to happen. It doesn't mean that it doesn't make Jesus any less important or special, but I think there's something important about someone representing Christ on behalf of the assembly and saying, this isn't about me, it's about what God is doing in, through, and among us. Yeah.
Hey, so at the Worship Jubilee in Atlanta in July, we had some small group focus conversations at the end of the Jubilee, and then you said, I'm going to gather all these together and write up a report, and I was wondering where you were with that and what the next steps are, if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
Anna's question is about the Worship Jubilee we had in Atlanta this summer. We had 830 people come to Atlanta for the Worship Jubilee. This is the third one of these we've had, and it was in conjunction with the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians. The last day, all of those folks were invited into small group visioning time to where they helped answer 5 important questions. We're going to take all that information, and a group of us is gathering in Chicago in October. There's 15 people who are from around the ELCA that I'm gathering together who are going to come up with a 5-year plan for the hopes and dreams of worship in the ELCA. Some of those things are improving our resources to the Hispanic population. working on resources for conversations around racism, doing trainings around the church on like mini jubilees, if you will, as well as working with Augsburg Fortress and already existing resources that we can improve upon, and a host of other things. Yes?
Thinking about who can preside. I was at a seminar where a man who was both a lawyer and an ordained pastor was talking about the similarities between, that ordained people can preside, but then the lawyer's code of ethics that part of a lawyer's duty is to encourage people to seek lawyers for legal advice and not people who don't do law. And he said this was for the good order in the law, but he said, I can't deny that we as lawyers have a stake in that. There's an element of job security involved in protecting this. And I would hope that the conversation about who gets to preside involves lay theologians as well, that it's not just folks who are ordained and have a stake in it in terms of job security. Well, this is the thing that we do, that the whole church are involved in that.
Yeah, and to answer that, I don't know who's involved in the total conversation, because this is the conversation specifically just happening right now with the Conference of Bishops. And this is something that's on their agenda, but it's also a conversation that I get asked about quite often. Just to add a real quick comment to that, pastors, and I'm speaking to the choir, pastors don't just preside. And so pastors who are ordained to word and sacrament, your job, your role is not just to preside at table. Your job is to preside over all of word and sacrament. Your job is to offer means of grace. So it's not just about table presidency. It's also about proclamation of the gospel. It's about baptizing. It's about inviting people into Christian assembly with catechesis. It's about visiting people. It's about being a church administrator.
And I'm sorry that I gave the impression that...
Oh, you didn't. I'm just saying in
it.
general. I just want to throw that out there, that if we're going to have a conversation about lay presidency and who gets to preside, then again, back to my original point, we need to have a conversation about what is ordination. Because if you're being ordained into the ministry of word and sacrament to be a pastor in the church, what is your job description? And then what is someone's job description who's not ordained for word and sacrament ministry, but they were given ordination in their baptism as a child of God? How does their life look like? What is their job description? And how are those different? How are they similar? How do they intersect? That's my question, to add on to that. We're about out of time. Is there one last question? Okay, Martin and I want to just share with you some resource information here. I've already shared the Worship Matters book, but do you want to tell them about a few other things?
Actually, the commercial comes at the end, right? There were just a few things. This is what I could fit into my bag, and so I didn't bring all kinds of cranberry-colored books along. But that maybe the first thing to say is to be sure that you're looking at some of the resources in those books. I do have my little pastoral care volume with me, and I'm continually reminded of some of the things that are there in terms of prayers. There's that little rite for when a child dies at or before birth that offers some helpful guidance in the way that Kevin has described. And so be sure that you're looking at those for potential help with you as you confront these sort of sometimes edge situations around worship. But as we all know, those things are evolving. So the question is, how do we continue to make some of those things available? I mean, just in terms of one of the things that I'm charged with, my role incorporates worship, music, and then also other congregational curriculum type resources, mainly for adults and around Lutheran topics like the sacraments. So we're about to start, working on developing a new body of resources for preparation for communion. We'll need to have some good help from lots of folks to how to maybe shift some of the focus of that, or to think about some of the questions that have risen just since 2008 or 2009. But Kevin also mentioned there's a couple of books that actually look sort of alike. There's that Worship Matters that Kevin talked about, which is kind of Worship 101 primarily for young adults. we are just actually starting to work on some more robust resources for children around kind of Lutheran topics, not just the sacraments, but about worship and about what does it mean to be Lutheran, about Martin Luther, and some of this is in connection with the 500th anniversary of the Reformation that's coming up, but also as we're looking forward. Some of the resources that actually help with those things with children are like 20 years old, so they need some new life. Another kind of set of resources is called Leading Worship Matters. And when we talk about some of the things that we've addressed today about how does the Word come to life, for instance, in the congregation, and one of the things that came up in those questions that came from the Jubilee, for instance, was we really need help having people be able to read Scripture and actually proclaim the reading of Scripture in such a way that it can be heard and understood and so forth. So the Leading Worship Matters is a source book that has information and helps for all of those different areas of ministry, from acolytes and greeters and ushers and communion assistants and lectors and the like. And then there's also a few smaller books that have been prepared to kind of give away to readers. Getting the Word Out is the handbook for readers and lectors. It's really kind of a instruction / inspiration, and to help improve that ability to claim the word faithfully in the assembly. On the kind of crossing over between word and other areas of worship, just this last year there's a new resource called "And These Are Similar Words: Crafting Language for Worship." And it picks up on the phrase that you'll see much more often in ELW than ever before. It was there a couple times in Lutheran Book of Worship, but boy, before that, it was the minister shall, or the minister may sometimes, but usually it's shall, and the congregation shall or should. And in ELW, there's this huge shift towards much more of the use of, it's just descriptive. The minister says, the presiding minister says, "In these are similar words." Well, what does that really mean? I mean, so there's some words there that work in probably a lot of circumstances, but they don't work in all circumstances. So this was a resource that was developed in collaboration with the worship staff and a number of others, particularly younger people who are in ministry settings, to give some really practical guidance about if you are going to contextualize the language of worship, not getting rid of the ancient words that hold us, but oftentimes supplementing or working around them. How would you go about that in a particular setting? And so I commend that one to you as well. It has some good exercises to work with a worship committee or a group that's doing that. It's not to say that you have to write a new service every week, but how could you take the words of worship and contextualize them so that they're more suitable to your situation? Around baptism, we mentioned a couple of resources from the North American Association of the Catechumenate. Pastor Paul Hoffman from Seattle, Washington, has done a couple of really fine books, Faith Forming Faith, and the second one I don't remember the title of, but they're published by Whippenstock. And then in the Augsburg Fortress family of resources, the Washed and Welcome resources are intended to do that not only for baptism of children, but also there's a second book called Go Make Disciples, which is an approach to that formation process for adults leading up to baptism. This is just one example of that family, which happens to be a book to give to parents and sponsors at baptism, 101 ways to help children grow into their baptism. Again, that idea that catechesis doesn't just happen at one time, but as they're growing up. So age-appropriate ways in which to instruct around baptism as children get a little bit older.
And these are all listed on the sheet.
They're on, yeah. There was a sheet on the table. If you didn't find that yet, I just pulled a couple of key things that correspond to each of these topics in the use of the means of grace. And you're certainly welcome to ask me any other questions, but that's a brief description of some things. Yep.
Thanks. We're going to sing. We'll sing.
Yep.
Before I pray and we sing, I just wanted to say a special word of thanks to you for your attentiveness and conversation. Also, a word of thanks for you and what you do for this church. I said this morning, and I really do mean this, you have, I think, one of the coolest calls. You get to serve the church. And I hope you know that's a gift, even on days where it may feel like a burden. And I also hope you know that you have brothers and sisters across this church who pray for you diligently and fervently and faithfully very, very often. And so know that your work is not in vain. And God has not called you to this vineyard for there not to be a harvest. The harvest is plentiful, and these laborers to me look like they're ready for good mission. And so I'm thankful for what you offer to the ELCA, and I'm thankful for our time today, to your bishop and to Jane and the Synod staff for their hospitality, and to my colleague Martin for doing this prior to going to Leipzig on Friday. So much thanks to y'all. So thank you very much. Thank you. And Jane's running, so.
To the front so that I would be on the camera. Certainly on behalf of the Northern Texas, Northern Louisiana Mission Area, we'd like to thank you. Never too late to get an education. We'd like to thank you, Kevin and Martin, both for being with us. It's been a wonderful conversation and one that we've been looking forward to for quite some time.
Thanks.
So thank you and Godspeed as you return back to your respective homes.
Yep, tonight. Thank you. Thanks. We stand, we pray, and we sing. The Lord be with you. O God, you've called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths as yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us, your love supporting us, through Christ our Lord. Amen. We sing together, Rise, O Church, like Christ arisen. Rise, O Church, like Christ arisen. Right as of and grace, may we through love and vision, whose we are and whose our praise. Alleluia, alleluia, God, the wonder of our days. Rise, transformed, and choose to follow after Christ through wounded whole. Broken, shed, our lives are hallowed to release and to console. Alleluia, alleluia, Christ our present, past, and goal. Rise, remember well the future God has called us to receive. Present by God's loving nurture, spirited then let us live. Alleluia, alleluia, Spirit, grace by whom we live. Service be our sure vocation, courage be our daily breath, mercy be our destination, from this day and unto death. Alleluia, alleluia, rise, O Church, a living faith. Go in peace and serve the Lord.